Tensions have flared across American university campuses this past week, with pro-Palestinian demonstrations which have left university leaders struggling to balance demonstrators' rights to free speech with the need to maintain order and to ensure that other students, in particular Jewish ones, do not feel intimidated. The latest protests, which demand that universities cut ties with organisations that might assist Israel's military, began after police arrested pro-Palestinian demonstrators at Columbia University last week, leading students at more than 20 colleges to put up tent encampments as expressions of solidarity, but in defiance of police warnings. The Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, on Wednesday condemned pro-Palestinian protests at the universities in the United States as horrific, saying that the demonstrations have to be stopped and describing some of the students as anti-Semitic. To discuss this, I'm joined by the Executive Director of Stand With Us UK, Isaac Zarfati. Welcome to GB News. There's nothing very unusual about student unrest, student protest. It certainly happened big time in my day. Why does Benjamin Netanyahu get so excited about this? Why does he think that it's anti-Semitic? Why does he think that it has to be stopped?
Because when you test the slogans and you see the sentiment, you see that they are aiming towards Israel as a Jewish state. They are calling to the annihilation of Israel as a Jewish state. When they are chanting river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they mean that the Jewish people should be removed from Israel into I don't know where. So obviously we are seeing a very strong anti-Semitic trend, and I think that that's why he meant what he meant. But generally, I think that what we see right now on campuses is part of a well-organized plan. We are monitoring the situation on campuses here in the UK for many years, and we saw this growing toxic environment year by year. So for instance, right after October 7th, hours after the massacre, we saw students in Manchester University and other London universities actually celebrating a slaughter of 1,200,000 people. So I think that right now we are moved to a new phase in what we saw in the last few years.
So it is your suggestion that what is happening in these American campuses is organized by somebody or something. Do you want to put your finger on that?
Yeah, I think that we can see signs for that. So first of all, when you see the protests on the streets and when you see the protests on campus, you can see that they all holding the same signs, the same design, the same chants, the same flag. So it's well organized in terms of everything that happens around it. And you see the timing, like one might ask himself, October 7th happened half a year ago. Why those protests got to their peak specifically right now? Why not before? Obviously, I think the IDF is already finished the most intense part of the war. Situation is much calmer right now compared to what it was 3 months ago. So why now? And I think that one of the reasons is in order to prevent and put pressure on Israel not to get into Rafah, in order to eliminate the Hamas leadership. And for me, these are signs that those protests are part of a well-organized structure that is meant to put pressure not only on Israel, but also on America, on the United States. That's why I think that those protests are right now, or the extreme phase of those protests are taking place in the United States and not in Germany, in the UK, or any other Western countries.
I imagine that few cities in the world have a bigger Jewish population than New York City. So what has been the reaction of the Jewish population in New York to what's happening in Columbia, in the heart of Manhattan?
So it's not only the Jewish community, it's also professors, Jewish professors in those universities that are basically prevented from entering campus. And I think that there is a significant problem, not only in the US, but also here in the UK, when universities choose to tackle this situation in a very odd way. And instead of limiting the protesters, the one who are using violence in order to prevent freedom of speech from others, they are trying to minimize the presence of the Jewish professors and the Jewish community. And we see it on the streets here as well in the UK. When there are those rallies around the streets, the police is trying to prevent the Jews from entering those areas instead of allowing them the freedom of movement as it should be. So I think that the way that the governments and the authorities are running these issues is very, very problematic.
But what I was getting at was, I can think of few less promising places to hold a pro-Palestinian demonstration than New York City, given its very large Jewish population. So what I'm saying is, the Jewish population of New York City getting organised with its counter-protest?
I'm sure they will, by the way. They did it, I think, 3 or 4 months ago when we saw another wave of protests on campus. But we have to bear in mind that those protests are taking place in New York City, regardless the size of the Jewish community there. This is the world stage. These universities are the production line. And by the way, every university is a production line of the future leadership of a society. And when you are taking over, when you are controlling the hearts and minds of students in those prestige universities, specifically in New York City, you're basically shaping the future leadership of the country. And this is also a sign and a call for action for other people. So I think that the reason they chose New York is not necessarily related to the number of Jewish people that are there, but because of the importance of those universities.
What do you think would be the appropriate reaction of the university authorities? Let's stick with Columbia for a moment. You've put your finger on some things you think they've done wrong. What about the admission of the police to the campus? Was that the right thing to do?
Yes, for sure. Because I think that, freedom of speech has its limitations as well. And I think that one of the problems that we are facing right now is that the moral systems, the university systems, lost the distinction between right and wrong. And they basically don't understand that these protesters and the organizations and the states that are behind those protests are using the freedom of speech and using Western values in order to attack the body. And at some point, universities has to draw a line and to say, look, freedom of speech is okay, but we cannot allow violence and occupying territories on campus to taking place. And they have to draw a line here. And I think that they did wisely when they let the police get in and remove those protesters.
You say that this is organised and it's a way of putting pressure on the United States. But the reaction I've seen so far from President Biden and from other leaders, by the way, in both of the main parties in the United States, has been pretty hostile and very critical of these protests that are occurring on the campuses. Why do you think then that anyone would think that getting the campuses to rise up would be an effective way of putting pressure on the administration? It would seem to me that it was possibly quite counterproductive.
So I think, first of all, we have to distinguish between the rhetoric and the things on the ground. So there are some things that the government needs to say, but on the ground, they understand the pressure that is coming, especially when the elections are very close. Obviously, the pressure is there, and I think, as I said, it's part of an organized system to put pressure on the U.S. government and on Israel. And you saw, I think that one of the things that they are hoping is to create maybe a chain effect and to spread those protests and riots to the streets as well, and not only to limit them to campuses. So I'm sure that those protests are doing their effect on the government. And I want to say another thing. When you go to those students and ask them about the reason that they are protesting, when you're trying to understand what is the level of knowledge that they have, and there was one picture that captured my eye. There is a very viral photo of a student, an American student, sitting on the grass on Columbia University, I believe, with a guitar, a long hair, looked like a peace kid from the 60s, sure. And the Hezbollah flag is right underneath him. The Hezbollah flag, a terror organization that killed hundreds of American soldiers. So obviously, this kid is rather an ignorant, or he knows what he does and is and that is another level. But I think that the level of ignorance among those students are huge. And one of the reasons is that universities, especially here in the UK, prevented from organizations like us to get into universities and to educate kids and to share with them some other aspects about reality. So those students are basically living in an echo chamber of a fake reality about the situation, and that's why they're acting this way.
Rather lazily, historically, we've said, the United States tends to be pro-Israel because it has a very large Jewish population, very influential in its elections. What would be your analysis now of the balance of Jewish influence and Muslim influence in the American electorate?
Well, it's a very hard question, but I think that we are facing a historic turning point, because for the first time, at least to my knowledge, you see that the American candidates to presidency are calculating their steps based on what the I don't think it's Muslims, the pro-Palestinian groups in America will do. And when you see the president, trying to be very sensitive with regards to his statements and steps towards Israel in the war, mixing with his decisions, that's something very problematic. And I think that we will see it growing and growing in the future. And that's something that we need to be to put our attention on.
A very interesting analysis from Isaac Zarfati. Thank you very much indeed. After the break, I was speaking to Julian Lloyd-Webber about his fundraising efforts to save an Elgar festival, which is taking place in the early summer. So please stay with us for that.